Let's put our hands together to welcome Mr. Eric Byres as he takes us through his presentation on evolving threats and emerging regulations in OT software supply chain security. Eric, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks. It's wonderful to see you all here. So many of you. I remember this event 2 years ago when it first started, and I think we could have all fit in that little corner over there. And to see 800 of you here is really a testament to the people of Singapore, the government of Singapore, and how seriously you are taking OT security, and really impressive. So I just want to, for a second, I want you all to pat yourself on the back because I do think you're making a difference. Now, I want to also set a few expectations and baselines on my talk. First of all, I'm not going to tell you war stories about supply chain attacks. I am sure most of you here are familiar with things like the SolarWinds, Sunburst events, Dragonfly, Pipe Dream, etc. So if you're not familiar with those, grab me out in the hall. I'm happy to fill you in on those. So I'm not going to be talking about supply chain attacks on OT. There's been enough of those. And again, happy to talk about those offline. Second thing is I'm going to make the assumption that most of the people in this room are operators of CIA or work for operators of CIA and not vendors. So I'm going to focus on how the supply chain regulatory world is going to impact you. Again, if you're a vendor and you're curious about how the regulations are going to impact you as a vendor of software, grab me a beer. Or buy me a beer. So then the last thing I'm going to say is there's way too much material on these slides. I committed one of the great sins of speaking and put too much material on my slides, but you'll all be getting a copy of the slides later, and I really wanted to use them as references. So feel free, I'll be skipping over some of the stuff. Feel free to ask me for a copy, or I believe OTCEP will be sending them out to you, and there's tons of material in there. Okay, there we go. Okay, so with all that said, I want to start off by focusing on two things. Untangling what I call a supply chain attack and trying to define it in a way that's useful. And the reason I want to do this is because I think it's really important that we have a baseline of what we think a supply chain attack is. And I also want to talk a little bit about what I see as the trends. And the trends right now are very, very clear. There's lots of different metrics. This is one metric on supply chain attacks that comes from Sonatype. And I don't really like their way of measuring. They say there's 1 million attacks. I don't actually believe that. But what is interesting is they keep their measurement of metrics consistent over the last 5 years. And whatever they're measuring is definitely increasing a lot. 742 over per year. More of whatever they call a supply chain attack has happened. I think that's probably maybe a little bit high. If you look at the NISA research from the EU, they say that the year-over-year amount of increase in supply chain attacks is only 400%. It's still a really, really big number. And the trend makes sense because supply chain attacks give the attacker the potential to impact tens of thousands more victims versus a direct one-on-one attack. You consider Sunburst, SolarWinds. The likely perpetrators, which was probably the Russian intelligence service, SVR, they attacked one company, SolarWinds. They successfully infiltrated 18,000. So this is a pretty good return on investment for a bad guy. So whether their objectives are money, like we saw on the Kaseya ransomware attacks, espionage, like we saw on SolarWinds, or pure outright destruction and carnage, like we see with NotPetya and potentially with Pipe Dream, the sophisticated attackers can multiply their success by targeting the supply chain. I'm going to go on to that a little bit more in a bit, but what exactly is a supply chain attack? And there's a lot of debate on what constitutes a supply chain attack. I'm going to look at a few formal definitions, go over them with you, and here's one. This is the one that comes out of CISA in the United States, and they say a software supply chain attack occurs when a cyber threat actor infiltrates a software vendor's network and employs malicious code to compromise the software before the vendor sends it out to its customers. This compromised software then compromises the customer's data or systems. I don't like this one because I think it's too narrow. It focuses specifically on malicious code and I'll mention, I probably shouldn't say this word, but Stuxnet. The impact on the supply chain was theft of code signing keys, but it's still a supply chain attack. So it's specifically focused on malicious code, vulnerable code, malicious code. There's all sorts of obsolete code. So I think this is a bit narrow. And secondly, it demands that the attackers actually attack and infiltrate a third-party supplier. And I think that's also a little narrow because that rules out things like the Sentient attacks that the French agency specifically called a supply chain attack. It rules out things like Log4j. So I'm not crazy about that definition. Here's another one from NIST in the US government. They say attacks that allow the adversary to utilize implants or other vulnerabilities inserted prior to the installation in order to infiltrate data, manipulate information, blah, 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 during any point in the life cycle. I think this is probably a better definition. Again, it tends to be a bit software focused, and we're certainly seeing supply chain attacks that are not necessarily completely about software. Theft of code signing keys being a good example. Here's one that my team put together. I think this is more captures what I believe a supply chain attack is, and that's attacks that exploit the inherent trust between the participants in the software supply chain to target and exploit one or more end users of a product. And it's the trust that we're breaking that really matters. This is what supply chain attackers do. They go after a desired end target, an oil company, power company, by exploiting the trust they have with their suppliers. And Dragonfly was a really good example of this. I spent a lot of time working on post-Dragonfly analysis for one of the companies, and it was really, really striking how, because the users of the software that the Russian intelligence agencies had infiltrated, or the suppliers of the software, and got into these IT software suppliers, the end users really trusted that software was good and did all sorts of things to circumvent checks and balances in their organization because the software was trusted. And so this is the real core part of the supply chain attack. It's taking advantage of trust. And with that comes a couple of really important takeaways, which I need to thank ANISA for really calling out in their report, their excellent report. One, an organization could be vulnerable to a supply chain attack even if its own defenses are good. Again, if I go back to Dragonfly, the company that I spent a lot of time in their offices analyzing really had crummy security. It was a tier 2 supplier of OT hardware, and even a year later, they still had rotten defenses. So they were an easy weak link. The companies that got actually impacted by the attack, their users, their customers, actually had, some of them had very good security posture. It didn't help them because they trusted a weaker link. The other thing that I should mention that I think is really important is that these are multi-stage attacks. And as a result, they are complex. It's not a script kiddie attack. And ANISA points out that of the supply chain attacks, I think they looked at 42, that at least 50% of them were directly attributable to an ATT group or a well-known criminal organization. And the other 50%, they just couldn't attribute at all. And this isn't surprising to me. I honestly believe that supply chain attacks are complicated enough that it's not going to be beginner hackers that are going to use them. And if you're under attack in a supply chain attack, you're going to have a sophisticated adversary. Now, what's happened because of this increase in number and awareness of these supply chain attacks, and again, there's so many names that we all know of, whether it's Kaseya or Sunburst or on and on and on, there's been a barrage of regulations, and I want to focus a little on this. First of all, there's no question the US sort of led the charge. There'd been some industry-specific regulations out of the medical industry and out of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, prior to SolarWinds. But then when SolarWinds came out and really scared the US administration, and by May, a few months later, I guess it was a year later, Executive Order 14028 really brought the supply chain front and center in US regulatory positioning. If you read the executive order, a full quarter of that executive order deals with software supply chain. And it mentions something called software bill of materials, which I'll talk about in a second. And then you've seen this whole, as a result of that order, this whole collection of further documents that were required in the executive order coming out over the last 3 years. So huge momentum there. But it's not just in the United States that we're seeing this. If you go internationally, for example, ENISA started in 2021 in Europe to publish really, really good documents on what the supply chain attacks were and what you could do about it. The EU Cyber Resiliency Act, while not formally adopted yet, again, there's extensive mentions of supply chain and software bill of materials. And of course, not to miss a very important document on the international stage, which is Singapore's own CII supply chain program. Really an outstanding piece of work, really, I think, leading the charge in this area. And we're seeing an incredible drive. And people ask me, well, where do you get more requests for guidance and software bill of materials? And actually, it's out of Europe right now. We're seeing a lot of pressure out of Europe. Even though the US was sort of ahead, we're seeing more companies in Europe adopt supply chain management and practices in Europe. That's my personal experience. Lots of stuff going on in industry-specific endeavors. FDA takes their ensuring cybersecurity of medical devices takes effect this October. It absolutely demands things like suppliers must provide a software bill of materials. The bulk electrical system came out a long time ago, doesn't actually say software bill of materials, but it does say you must verify the authenticity and integrity of all software you buy. And the automotive industry has a number of drafts. So lots of, I mentioned this earlier this morning in a meeting with Minister Toe. It is not necessarily the government regulations that are driving a lot of we're seeing a lot of industry and specific company regulations and requirements and procurement happening that's saying, hey, we got to get our handle on this. And then there's lots and lots, in the interest of time, I won't go through the IEEE model, or sorry, the IEEE, the Edison Institute model, lots of really interesting research and industry-specific documents to guide supply chain management. But the important thing here for somebody who is an asset owner, an operator of CII, is what I call trust and verify. Now, back in the late 80s, some of you are old enough to remember when Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan were negotiating the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Reagan adopted a Russian proverb, which I will mangle because I don't speak, dovoyai no provoyai. And it means trust but verify. And I think that has got to be the proverb we use in the supply chain. He stated that the reason he was doing this, we wanted extensive verification procedures so that we enable both sides to monitor compliance with the treaty. And I think that's exactly, as users of the industrial control systems, rather than producers of software, you want that ability to trust but verify. Okay. I should mention there's lots of guidelines on what the software developers in the open source community are supposed to be doing. I'm not going to cover that right now because I don't think there's that many software developers. Again, something I'm happy to talk about on the side. Okay, but I've mentioned the term software bill of materials at least 10 times because it's absolutely through these documents as a requirement for the operator to demand a software bill of materials. So what is a software bill of materials? I want to define this, and it's a very clear definition here from the US Department of Commerce. It's a formal record containing the details and supply chain relationships of the components used in building software. That seems pretty simple. And if I compare it to this can of sardines here, it's like that ingredients list sitting on the can of sardines. Now, when you go and buy a can of sardines or a can of soup, you know you're getting, well, let's say sardines, you know you're going to get sardines, but you're going to get a lot more. When you buy software, you know you're going to be buying a HMI or you're going to buy a PLC, but you're going to get a lot more, and it's the lot more you really want to know about. Now, just like this can of soup or sardines, those labels, those SBOMs, whatever you want to call them, whether you want to call it an ingredients label or an SBOM, it's providing transparency. It is not risk analysis. So if you look at this label here, it's got what I expected in a can of sardines, and then down at the bottom, something called xanthan gum. Now, is that good for you or bad for you? I actually don't know. Somebody told me it can give you diarrhea, but I don't know if that's true. Maybe that's bad for you. But the fish can doesn't tell you. The ingredients list doesn't tell you. A software bill of materials is not a risk analysis. It's an ingredients list. So it's the first step towards transparency. You, as the users of those software bill of materials, are going to be responsible for trying to do risk analysis on the software bill of materials you get. So let's take that back to the software side and away for sardines. Okay, again, it's the ingredients list. The second thing I want to point out, this is a graphic view of a software bill of materials for a small piece of software used in data historians. And I want to point out, unlike that can of soup, software bill of materials are complicated and large. If anybody ever gives you a software bill of materials that's 10 lines long, tell them to go back home and try again. This is what you should expect to see. And if anybody gives you a software bill of materials on a spreadsheet, tell them forget it. It is simply that is just not the reality in software today. This is the reality in software today. Now, if we drill in here and we can dig in, we can see, hey, here's a piece of software buried deep inside modules. It's a CHM, and that's the end of the software bill of materials. You need to know that those type of files are high risk, that they've been deprecated by Microsoft. It's a format from back in, I think, Windows 95 for help files, and they're not good to have in your software. But that's, unfortunately, as the receiver in SBOM, that's what you have to figure out. Sorry for the bad news. But what the good news is, people say, oh, there's no formats. That's absolutely not true. One of the things that have been really successful in the SBOM community is an agreement on two things. What are the minimum requirements for SBOM? And there are 8 minimum requirements that you can see here, and 3 approved formats: SWID, SPDX, and CycloneDX. Forget the first one. I'm pretty sure it's dead. Consider it to be the ArcNet or token ring of software bill of materials. The last 2 are going to dominate the market. But they are well-defined, they're well-supported, and the beauty of this is that complexity you saw in the previous slide, these formats, because of the consistency, will really give us the ability to handle SBOMs in a large-scale data lake, machine learning type environment. And I think that's critical because there's no way a human being should try and read a software bill of materials. There's another thing that's worth mentioning is when do you generate an SBOM? And the NTIA made a statement that there's 3 types of SBOMs: during source, during the build, and post from the binary. Don't say one is better than the other. Each of them have their place. And I like to make this an analogy to medical imaging. You know, when you go to the doctor, they may do an X-ray, they may do an ultrasound, they may do an MRI. A doctor came along and said, I only do X-rays, I don't do anything else, is really missing the point. Every one of those imaging capabilities gives you different information. Every time you run a SBOM using a different technique, you get additional information. And I think that's really important to understand, that the sum is greater than the parts when it comes to SBOMs. For quite a few years going forward, there will be no definitive correct SBOM. There will be good approximations, and good approximations, just like in medical imaging, are very, very valuable. Don't wait for the perfect SBOM. Okay. Now, what do we do with all these SBOMs that we're going to get, which we're required to ask for in many regulations? And this is really the important part, okay? And the first thing I want to say here is, before SBOMs, our responses to embedded software vulnerabilities like Log4j were terrible. This was a talk that was given by one of the chief information officer and one of the big 3 U.S. defense contractors. His team, when they heard about Log4j, phoned vendors to ask if they had Log4j. This is exactly the type of thing an SBOM can help address. And in fact, a year earlier, this company in the SolarWinds, a different company, one of the big software IT companies, had a good SBOM process. And they were able to address the risks from whether they had the SolarWinds infected Orion products in their products within 2 hours. 2 hours versus 2 weeks. And in fact, I am aware of companies that took 2 months to figure out whether they're infected with SolarWinds Orion. That is the difference between success and failure in cybersecurity. And SBOMs give us that ability to respond. And that is really, really the important part to me. The second thing I want to point out is that the SBOMs are the beginning of a series of documents that you will be receiving over the next few years, I hope. The second one is a vulnerability disclosure report. Currently, the way we get vulnerabilities by looking up in the National Vulnerability Database or other databases is exceedingly fraught with bad crap. The database isn't consistent, it's not updated, it's not, the terminology changes. You can't even consistently look for a name on a product. Let me give you a very specific example. A lot of you use software that has products that came from Flexera in order to lock that license keys on that software. If you go back and you search for Flexera, you'll find Ravina, you'll find Gemalto, you'll find SafeNet. These are all companies that own that software through its lifespan of the last decade. And so you may discover in a software bill of materials that you've got Flexera software, but the vulnerabilities will be listed in the National Vulnerability Database as, say, SafeNet vulnerabilities. So one of the things that's going to help a lot is for the vendors to be putting out VDR or vulnerability disclosure reports that specifically list not only the vulnerabilities at the top level, but what are all the vulnerabilities in the SBOM and how do they impact that product. So I think this is going to be a big move forward. Another big move forward is vulnerability exploitability exchange documents. Again, this is a document, and it can be for a single product, or just like VDRs, or this can be a document that will cover a whole product range or a product family, and it will describe the risks associated to those vulnerabilities and if they're exploitable, which is what the title is. And Rob really said it really well, that only about 2% of the vulnerabilities out there are ones you should actually care about, and the rest you can worry about later. And I believe that what VEX will give us over the next few years is the ability to get to that 2% and say, yep, these are vulnerabilities, I'll get around to them someday. These are exploitable vulnerabilities, and these are exploitable vulnerabilities that are being exploited, those are the ones I want to focus on. And I think that's going to be the most important thing out of all of this, is the ability to focus our risk efforts on what is a high-risk vulnerability or a high-risk weakness or a high-risk problem, and stop moving towards, we're just going to patch everything, and start focusing on what we need to patch. So some key takeaways that I hope you guys have picked up from this. First of all, the trick or the challenge with the supply chain security problem is that even if your organization has very good defenses, it can be highly vulnerable to supply chain attacks. And the only way we're going to get around this is transparency. Building transparency up and down the chain between the owners who are operating CII and the people who supply the software. When you have a situation like Rob mentions, where you have a product that's using code assist, and you don't even know you've got code assist, and you're perfectly aware that there's a risk called pipe dream, but you don't know you're impacted, that's a problem. As an operator, you need to know whether you're running code assist software, even if it says something else on the label, even if it says Schneider, even if it says one of the hundreds of companies that runs code assist. So that lack of visibility puts you at risk. And with proper supply chain regulations and that ability to look down the chain and communicate with your suppliers, you can start to address that risk. And I want to also point out that this is not just a government initiative, even though the US government drove it at the start. We really see industry now saying, suppliers, we want to understand what we're buying. And only when we understand what we're buying can we really address the risks that we're facing. And finally, the SBOM is not the end of the journey. It makes your risk analysis possible, but it's not a risk analysis. It won't replace it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric, for the really engaging presentation, concise, to the point. May I invite you to remain on stage and take a seat, as you'll be taking part in the panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to invite Dr. Lim Woo Lip, the Senior Vice President and the Chief Technology Officer of ST Engineering, to come up on stage. Joining him for this panel, we have Mr. Dale Peterson, the founder of security consulting firm Digital Bond and S4 Events. And then we have Dr. Terence Liu, the Chief Executive Officer of TX1 Networks. And moderating the panel is Dr. Magda Celli, the Managing Director and the Chief Information Security Officer at Responsible Cyber. Let's give them a big round of applause, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much for attending this exciting panel. I am very glad today to have a wonderful list of panelists, and we had this extremely interesting presentation by Mr. Eric Byers. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. We have as well today Dr. Lim Woo Lip, Dr. Terence Liu, and Mr. Dale Peterson. So as we have heard during the presentation by Eric, definitely software supply chain threats are not only emerging, but we are seeing a really increasing focus on regulation around the world. And that definitely goes not only within the United States of America, but as well within Europe. And then we will see and discuss a little bit how the situation is changing in Singapore. So following this insightful presentation we just had, I would like first to make actually a joke.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned, Eric, that companies spend, some of them, 2 months looking if they're still vulnerable to SolarWinds. Well, I would say that some companies, I think they're still trying to figure out if they're vulnerable to, for example, Log4j.
Yes.
That's some time ahead. But let's start perhaps, first of all, to understand what actually companies can do to address the current challenges. Because while we understand that the threats are there, we understand that we don't have any other option rather than using the software as part of our supply chain. And of course, this is something that can impact our organization's security. How are we able to protect, as particularly professionals and practitioners in the CII, how are we able to protect the organization, and what should we do first? So Eric, I will start with you, please.
All right. First of all, I'm going to rephrase this ever so slightly because remember that protection is only one of the 5 pillars on the NIST CSF. You know, there's also detect, respond, and recover. And so I think the very first thing that we're going to have to do is start to look at those other pillars. And the Log4j example is a great example. We need to strengthen those other pillars. And as you said, there's lots of companies out there that couldn't find Log4j with both hands. I mean, they just lost it. So I think the very first thing that companies need to do is realize that they're probably going to get involved in implicated into a supply chain attack, not of their fault, and they're going to have a response. And that's the first thing. The second thing, move back to protect, and it's really going to be, how do you protect yourself? By getting visibility and understanding about what your vendors and suppliers are doing. And that could start out very, very simply by saying, hey, do you have a software bill of materials? I don't even care if you see it, just do you have a software bill of materials, and does it go down to your tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, third, fourth, fifth party, or is it just your tier 1? Just ask the question. I mean, now you start to get that company that's supplying you basically thinking about it, and then you can move on to, can you give me the software bill of materials, because I want to be able to scan it, to I want to take that software bill of materials and actually do risk analysis on it and understand my risks. But I think you can do a crawl, walk, run. But first of all, I think we need to start with our responses and getting our responses really robust.
Thank you, Eric. Anyone would like to add to this point?
What I think is we need to go back to the source of the issue, right? I think as a CII operator, I think you can impose certain standard on the vendor in terms of their software development, in terms of their system development. So we need to ensure that that process can be audited. So that will set the supplier, the vendor, on their toes to make sure that minimally you need to ensure the quality, the check, in order to meet the security requirement. So the supplier or the vendor should also take on some responsibility on these software supply chain issues. Then bringing back, I think the CII operator should also trying to implement monitoring and visibility on their own OT network, so that when software is being installed or a patch is being applied, at least they know exactly whether their network is behaving differently, right? So the anomaly detection is important, the visibility is important.
Thank you very much. I'm a little bit changing the questions following the presentation that we just had. And we had an exchange, Dale, before that, talking about not only the fact that vendors sometimes might actually just accept certain conditions in contracts because they want to win, for example, a project, right? And how that can affect those clauses that we have inserted in there. So I would like to hear a little bit more from your point of view, Dale, about this aspect. How are we able to ensure that while we trust our vendors, but we verify them with the contractual clauses, what are the additional measures that helps us to ensure that visibility and liability shift?
Well, I think if you look at this from the asset owner side, the people that are running ICS and providing us with the goods and services, I think it might be a long time before SBOMs are very useful to them in an operational sense. I mean, I think even the early adopters who are well down the maturity curve probably have 10 other things they should do first. But this procurement language that you're talking about, and these contracts, is where they can play an immediate role. Some of you may have used this for security development lifecycle. You were going to go to a vendor, you were going to buy something, you'd say, are you doing fuzz testing? Do you have a threat model? And that gave you some idea of where their development practices were. The same thing is true today with SBOMs. You can say, do you have an SBOM? If they say, no, we don't, well, that means their development process is very old and not modern. Because modern tools, modern software factories have plugins that will automatically create an SBOM and are very helpful to them for what they need to do. So you're getting an idea of where they are on this. And just one other example, your SBOM can give you an outdated component analysis. So it can tell you how many old components are in the SBOM. Now, I don't expect any asset owner to look at this in great detail, but if you see, well, they're doing major upgrades every 2 years and they have 8-year-old components in there, this means their development process is not looking at major upgrades, whether to update it. So I think there are, Magda, I think there are some opportunities around this without going through all the effort of bringing them in and trying to process them and address risk like what Eric said.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Dale. The first thing is ask them, do you have an SBOM? Then second, can I have a copy of that and make sure it isn't the ingredients list off a sardine can? And I know Zach talked to us this morning a little bit that they got some SBOMs that were probably closer to sardine can ingredients. You know, so even that basic inspection will start to give you an idea. So I totally agree with you there.
I think there are two very, very interesting points here. First of all, we need to make sure that there's awareness about SBOM, and then people and companies are aware that they can ask for it. And then the second point is definitely having the information or having data doesn't mean understanding risk. And that's exactly what, Eric, you mentioned. It's about two different things. And here I would like actually your opinion, Terence, about this specific aspect. What is, in your view, the perception, or what should organizations do to gather information or data and then actually transform it into insights that they can act on, especially with them, the OT software supply chain?
Yeah, I think. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I think that need to go with the security guideline and security companies of that specific security guideline or regulation to that specific company. Because let me extend this question a bit about the supply chain cybersecurity. So we were talking about SBOM, right? But how if the vendor deliver a product with, let's say, Windows 2000 operating system, Windows 7 operating system? I don't need a good SBOM to know it's vulnerable and it's risky, right? But many of my customers or prospects, they are still buying the product built with Windows 7, right? And so I want to echo about when Eric presented, and he mentioned the supply chain security could impact those ware defense enterprises. But what is ware defense? I mean, they could have very good defense in IT, but I rarely see a company with very good defense in OT. The majority of the companies, they even lack the basic cyber hygiene in OT. And in that case, with one vulnerable product get into the environment, and maybe even with the worm inside, you will be surprised that every month we still saw like a conflicker, configure, it's a worm developed 15 years ago, and mainly spread it through USB. But the careless operator, they just use the one USB. They don't care whether it's infected to transfer the files. And so, I think anyway. Back to the question. I think the organization should have a good acceptance criteria to carefully inspect whatever they are buying, and that has to go with their security policy.
Thank you very much, Terence. Eric, as well, you mentioned the complexity of the software in general ecosystem, and I think that goes beyond even within the enterprise level, or especially, the OT organizations or companies. So there is one domain that we know is challenging in general, even for smaller companies or companies that just have a website, let's put it that way, vulnerability management. And I have seen personally companies still managing that with Excel files, right? So now we are talking into integrating additional visibility and additional, perhaps, scope to the vulnerability management. So from your point of view, would that mean for the OT companies that they will have much more work to do because now they have as well the visibility of their software supply chain providers and they need to follow up on those vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think I gave a talk a couple of years ago for Dale called the Vulnerability Tsunami. I think the bad news, I'll be really honest, the total number of vulnerabilities, once we start looking into the supply chain, is going to explode. And this is going to absolutely kill the idea of let's just patch everything. I saw one of the questions coming up. Regulations that say patch everything are just absolutely going to die. And it's going to be about prioritization. But I do think as well that that's going to be possible because the only way that's going to be possible if we start to integrate that SBOM and that supply chain information into our existing asset management systems. You know, when I got into this 15, 20 years ago, most companies couldn't even tell you what their OT assets were, and if they did, they had it on a spreadsheet, which was usually a train wreck. We've made massive steps forward in being able to do good asset management now in OT. I believe that really all this is an extension of asset management. We're going from, oh, I've got an HMI sitting there to, oh, I've got an HMI sitting there running this software. Oh, and it's running all these other components. And so it's really, what we're really doing is just extending asset management. And until we do that, I can't remember who said it, I think already today once, but if you don't know what your assets are, you're not going to be able to defend them. And that includes, you don't know what your software is, you're not going to defend against it. But once you have that information, I think we are in the place that we can start doing risk prioritization and focus on the exploitable vulnerabilities, I don't care where they are in the stack, and the exploitable vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited, and forget the rest. Or put them to the side for a while and try and focus on what's important.
Yeah, indeed. So we have an extended attack surface. And then what I really liked in the previous panel is actually associating the risk with the loss scenario for the company to find the right decision or take the right decision when it comes to mitigation. Dale, what about your point of view on this topic?
I think it's one of the most fascinating things in this new product market. You know, Eric has a company, Adolis, there's Finite State, NetRise, Fortress. It's a product segment that's getting a lot of VC money coming in right now. I have confidence they'll solve the technical problems.
Yeah.
They're not that, I mean, there's a lot of, I wouldn't call it complexity, there's a lot of data, but they'll solve that. But really what's most interesting to me is the business models. Because if I'm an asset owner, I don't want to have to collect SBOMs from all the different vendors I want. And if I'm a vendor, I don't want to serve my SBOM up to tens of thousands of users because every new version is changing, the SBOM's changing, and you're getting all these changes. So if you think there's this big circle of users and a big circle of vendors, I think there's going to be some entity in the middle, these middlemen, that will gather this information. So if you're an asset owner and you say, oh, I've got, you know, you've been talking Log4j, you have your asset inventory at a high level, you send it to them, they send back that answer immediately. These, you know, these 57 products have Log4j, and by the way, it's not really exploitable on these 55, here's the 2 products you have to work with. Now, we're a long way from that, but that's what I'm watching most closely.
I think it will be a fantastic solution for many companies, definitely, especially around having that decision about exploitability that is not often that straightforward. But I'm conscious of time, and we have a lot of questions coming from our audience, which is fantastic, so please keep going. So we'll move to the next question, which actually tackles or addresses the most popular and hot topic of nowadays, artificial intelligence. We cannot ignore that. And definitely with technologies like generative AI, how are those impacting the way of how we are addressing software supply chain management or risk management in general, and how can they help, or on the contrary, how they can pose additional risk?
You mean the threat intelligence, is it?
Yes.
I think moving forward, things are moving so fast. Environment is dynamic. So threat intelligence, sharing of threat intelligence become very critical, right? So if we are a lot more transparent in terms of info sharing, in terms of intel sharing, I think especially within a sectorial or even at a national level or even international level, I think we can avoid a lot of attacks, right? Whether is it supply chain or any other OT attack, right? So I think moving forward, threat intelligence is particularly important, and the OT industry should see how they could leverage on all these informations to do self-assessment, vulnerability assessment, right? To review their own network to identify the issue early.
Thank you very much. I think this comes as a very important topic, knowledge sharing. So, Terence, I would like to hear your point of view on that, especially when you mentioned that some companies do not have yet the maturity that we would expect, especially in CII or in general, to in this specific complex environment. So, what are your insights on that? How do you find knowledge sharing, especially here within the region?
Again, the threat intelligence. I think we are on the path towards to that. But in reality is, I think many organizations are far away from being able to use that. Because threat intelligence are typically useful if you have a SOC and you have technologies like detection and response, EDR, XDR, and you collect those telemetries and you compare with the threat intelligence to know, as an expert to know if you have been compromised. However, in a lot of environment, they, again, lack of even the basic cyber hygiene. They don't have the anti-malware, don't have the firewall, IPS in OT, and not to mention the EDR and XDR, especially they have to overcome that they have to roll out multiple software agents onto the OT machine, and they have to overcome how do they send the telemetries or event back to cloud for further comparison. And not to mention, most of the OT environment, they lack of the cyber talents. So even you have the technology, maybe you don't have the talent to monitor the event. And if they monitor exactly the same event, just like what they do in IT, then the threat intelligence for OT is not going to use for. Well, 5 years ago, I asked, at that time, people argue about OT SOC and IT SOC. Would they be converged or would they be separate? And I talked that with Robert Lee, and he said, well, his point is there definitely need to be an OT SOC, and it doesn't need to be separated. However, you need OT expert to monitor those event and telemetries to be able to really recognize the threat. And that's the luxury thing many people don't have.
Thank you very much. I think the overall responsibilities between OT and IT is a different topic for another panel that would take hours as well. It's a debate. But let me come back about the new technologies. Eric, what are your views about integrating AI to help solve those problems?
I think you have to integrate AI to solve these problems. I mean, we do at the company I work for, Adolis. I mean, there's just simply the data lake is too big that humans can't scan the vulnerabilities. You need to use AI to be able to say, hey, this component is likely impacted by this vulnerability. It's not going to be a simple, let's just go look in the National Vulnerability Database, because the names will be spelled wrong. The company changed its name. It used to be called a G. Fanuc PLC. Now it's called an Emerson PLC. But the records say one thing.
The label on the box is another. We make pretty heavy use of AI and ML already. You just can't solve the problem if you don't, because the size of the data lakes are huge. I think this is also going to apply to everybody here. Now, whether it's generative AI, I'm still a little nervous about generative AI. We did a bunch of tests, and it gave us very, very high confidence false positives. It's confidently wrong. So there's some real tuning involved. But AI and ML, I think, are absolutely critical, or you're not going to solve the problem just because of the size of the data lake.
Yeah, I look at AI from different perspectives. As we have been discussing about the lack of talent, we don't have enough people, enough OT security people to help us in defending the OT environment. So AI, in fact, if you do it correctly, like generative AI, you can actually develop a system to help the OT cybersecurity defender to upskill their knowledge. Because if they are new to the environment, they might not have the knowledge, but actually in the open source, there are many information. If the AI is able to collate all this information and able to answer or advise the junior cybersecurity analyst with certain recommendation, I think that will help, right? On top of that, cybersecurity problem is moving toward a big data problem. There are a lot of data available that if we know how to leverage on it, we will be able to discover telltale signs that pointing to a possible cyber attack. And that, I think, is humanly impossible to manage it. So we need to leverage on AI, which help us to analyze and pick up all these anomaly, whether is it behavior or whether is it process, right? So I think AI, in whatever aspect, it will be helpful to the cybersecurity ecosystem.
Thank you very much. Again, I want to answer the audience questions, so I will go to the last point that I have, and it's around the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore CII supply chain program that was recently published. And I would like Eric to hear your thoughts about the program. Personally, it's I feel and I think it's a fantastic way to raise awareness, but also encourage companies to do the right thing. Eric, perhaps further insights from you.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with the program. I think it's actually really maybe the only one of its kind in the world, really giving the tools to people like you in the audience on what you're going to do to help manage your supply chain risk. So I think it's really a world leader in that area. What I hope, and we're, right now it's just the program outline that's been published, and you've still got other stages to actually get the tools in your hand and the documents for, there's a section on, if you haven't read it, there's a section on that'll be supplying contractual language, et cetera, what to ask from your vendors. What I hope that this integrates really, really well into is Singapore's other programs, so that it doesn't become a freestanding place where you have this ask for the same data twice. I really hope the two programs get well integrated. But right now, what I see is pretty exciting. I think Singapore's pretty much ahead of the world here in planning to provide the tools to the asset owner to manage the supply chain risk. So that's it.
Thank you. Dale, would you like to add on this?
Maybe broaden it a little bit. Eric showed a lot of different regulations up there in the US and Europe and other places. And I know this document isn't a regulation, but it might be strongly worded suggestions. So one of the things we've seen, the OWASP project has Cyclone DX, which is one of the formats Eric mentioned, and Dependency Track, which takes an SBOM and tells you what vulnerabilities are in that SBOM. Since the US regulations came out, they've seen a 10x increase in use of Dependency Track. The number, I should have the numbers on the top of my head, they're very large. Every day, a lot more companies are going and submitting SBOMs and testing them. So that's some pretty clear evidence that these regulations and programs like Singapore is going to put in place will drive the vendors to do this. Even if all their customers aren't requiring it, if the few key customers require it, then everyone else gets to ride along with those customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Regulation definitely drives adoption, and that might help the whole ecosystem. Okay, so let me just take a look at the different questions and make sure that we are able to address our audience inquiries. Give me a second. Okay, we have a question that got 9 likes, so I'm gonna just start with that one because clearly it's a concern for many of our audience. Just patch the 2% sounds logical by managing the high risks, low-hanging fruits. But in practice, regulators take the view that if it is vulnerable, it must be patched. How do you tackle this challenge? Who would like to take this question?
I'll take that one. So this is a message to all you regulators out there. Don't make regulations compliance-driven, make them risk-driven. And if you're currently facing a regulation that says you must patch everything, push back hard. Because I think that, in fact, I've got some notes for a talk tomorrow on this, but I think regulations that say you must do, you must check all these boxes are really counterproductive. And so David Ong, who submitted this question, I can see it in the list here, I think he's got a really good point, but this is really a message to regulators. Make your regulations risk-driven.
Thank you, Eric. Just to add, like, for example, I have seen practically, especially around some traditional audits, for example, for PCI DSS compliant companies, even if they're not compliant with something, they find a way to specify and describe the risk associated, and they show compensating controls. And it's a discussion as well with the regulators too, in many cases.
I'd actually say one other thing. You could even, just with little word changes, you can go with, not saying all vulnerabilities must be patched, but all currently exploitable critical vulnerabilities must be patched. Immediately puts risk context into the regulation. So it's not ideal, but it's 2 words that will at least start to fix the problem.
Thank you very much, Eric. Anyone would like to add? Terence?
Yeah, a bit. I mean, if the regulation said this gentleman or lady need to patch whatever vulnerability is there, I just feel sorry for him or for her, because that's not the common practice we have been experienced. I mean, even 2% is good. Many large manufacturers I've been working with, such like automotive, semiconductor, or pharmaceutical, some of them don't even patch at all. They do more like risk-based analysis. Where are the crown jewels? And then what kind of vulnerabilities would impact those crown jewels? So one of the company I've been working with, they have more than 200,000 assets. And the only patch that will apply is WannaCry. I mean, the MS-1710. Why? Because they've been hit by WannaCry. And they just try to secure the shop floor from being accessed from any outsider. So I like, if it's a standard to be discussed, I like a cybersecurity framework there where you can define what's the next step you want to be. Instead of the hardcore discipline, like 62443 said, in security level 4, you need to patch whatever it happened. But sometimes it's just not that easy to do that.
Can I just say a quick word? I don't want to let the asset owners off the hook. Okay, the 2%, this was now, never, or now, next, never. This was a framework that Art Mannion introduced at S4 a few years ago. So 2% was now. That means immediately, as soon as you practically can, get the patch on. Next was during your next maintenance window. So your cyber equipment needs maintenance just like your pumps and your rotors and all your physical equipment needs maintenance. I like to call it cyber maintenance as opposed to, you know, some of these patching and other terms, because you should have a maintenance plan for your cyber thing. So at your next outage, it should be upgraded, because if we don't do that, we get to your Windows 7 issue, right? So you can't take this, it's only 2% to say, oh, I never had to patch anything because those guys on stage said it's not so important. It's just you don't have to do it immediately. Do it as part of maintenance.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to address two questions together. The fact that actually maybe some automation in big companies would not like to disclose details, and specifically someone gave the example of ST Engineering telling about details of their, for example, components and specifically data diode appliances. So I think what would be your reply to that, and leading from this question, how those big companies like ST Engineering, again, would share information from there, what exactly is expected from those companies when sharing SBOM, and to which level of accuracy they should go?
Okay, I think as long as there's a good reason that we need to share, I don't think ST Engineering will not share. Okay, yeah. Okay, so if it's related to security, so that's why earlier I mentioned about we should actually identify the problem at the roots. Roots in the sense that basically if your process, your software development, you know, nowadays software development, a lot of software developer take the source code from open source, right? And GitHub has been an active place for hacker to hack, actually. So for any engineering company, if the customers has a good reason that they want to know further detail, let's say, for example, about the source code, about the detailed component being used, there's no reason why a vendor will say no, right? As long as things like non-disclosure agreement is being signed, you know, you don't reveal the architecture to our competitor, you know, that kind of thing. There's no reason why we wouldn't.
And I think it's, if I'm not wrong, Eric, it's a list of ingredients, like we call it, is not the same as sharing intellectual property. So we need to clarify that. There are two different concepts. Eric, would you like to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a list of ingredients. And there's also nothing in the SBOM standards, be it SPDX or Cyclone DX, that says you have to publish them up on your public website. There was a real misunderstanding because a lot of the SBOM technology came out of the open source community, and of course, hey, let's just throw it all up on GitHub. You know, what you just said there was great. You know, there's nothing stopping an SBOM also having a non-disclosure agreement attached to it. And I think that's the way we want to go. We don't want to make SBOMs just something that every kid can download off the internet. It's something you want to have a controlled access document. That's right.
But current state is a lot of the vendors in the OT space are not sharing SBOMs.
Correct.
Oftentimes because they don't have them, but some have them and just say, no, I'm not sharing that with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's changing, A, because the regulations, and second, some of their big customers are saying, hey, that's not going to work.
Yeah, I think moving forward, the situation will change.
Yeah.
But this exactly leads to the second part of the question is how accurate they should be. Because this is a question that the audience is asking themselves, right? If we have this list of ingredients, how are we actually expecting the vendor to be very accurate, giving us 100% of the list? Or is it like 80%, 70%? How do we actually have the kind of assurance, or are we setting some expectations to the vendors?
I can tell, just really quick, I mean, Cyclone DX has fields for this, where it says, oh, I've got all my first-party components, I have these for each component, it tells you how accurate it is, and then there's a confidence field as well that says, not only do they have this, but they have this level of confidence using these tools as to how it's correct. So it's envisioned in the standards today.
The objective is to get visibility and not to get 100% immediately from the first run.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I think we're going to be a long time before we get 100% accuracy. But go back to that can of sardines. I was in the food industry for quite a few years, and I'll tell you something else that's in just about every food product, and that's rat droppings. Sorry, but they show up there. But they are not listed in the ingredients list. So all ingredients lists have an approximation to, complete accuracy. I think we're working towards approximation. But I will say, to start with, the first place you can start is it even an SBOM? And there's lots of tools out there that will actually validate whether the SBOM is well formed and meets the specs. Pretty sure the OTCEP Foundation, I think, has a bunch of tools for validation. So there's lots of at least low-hanging fruit. Did I actually get an SBOM, or did I get the ingredients list off a can of sardines?
Actually, in my view, the ingredient is important, but the process of making the can of sardine is equally important. Right? Because if the process has some error, the proportion of the ingredient may vary. Right?
Yeah, I want to share a doable practice where we defined a standard for semiconductor industry and named the E187. And in this standard, it requires the tool equipment vendor, when they deliver the product, they have to make sure only necessary application been installed. So that reduce the probability of those risky applications. And only necessary service can be activated. And so they don't really do like SBOM level, they mainly do like application level. But if you reduce, so that's doable. And if you reduce the application to just several, and when the big vulnerability being found in certain library, it's actually not that hard for them to contact with all the tool equipment vendors. So how are you? Well, again, but the question back to, even the vendor managed to fix all the vulnerabilities in 2 to 3 months' time. But how long it would take for the buyer to patch them? That's the question beyond.
Thank you. So we'll use one last question from the audience to make a conclusion, because unfortunately time is getting to the end. The last question is, apart from SBOMs, is there other ways the end user organization can detect and protect itself against supply chain attacks? I think we have seen from the beginning, when Eric started his presentation, that it's all about understanding that our attack surface is expanding, and we should integrate the additional software and suppliers as our own assets and have that visibility, and integrate a risk-based approach to vulnerability management. And especially with the adoption of new technologies, we can use new emerging tools that are perhaps based on generative AI with caution, because there is a lot of false positive, to help us manage this data. And here I would like just to add for the conclusion that we're not only looking at AI, we soon will be talking about quantum computing as well. So there's a lot of other things that we need to keep in mind, and how that will affect our supply chain, but as well, how it will make us as weak as our weakest link, no matter what kind of protection we have in place. So here we come to the end of this panel. I would like to extend really my thanks to our distinguished panelists. It was very insightful and interesting. I hope the audience felt the same way as I did. The contributions were really not only enriching, but bringing a very good overview of how organizations in OT should have further visibility in their OT software supply chain security, and what should they implement to help protect their organizations. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you found, again, this panel and discussion insightful. Have a wonderful afternoon.